We've worked with our buttons a fair amount. We've restyled a lot of buttons up to this point. Let's go on to the next control. Let's take a look at checkboxes and radio buttons. Now when you right-click and create a checkbox, what you get is some pretty standard behavior. Now let me scroll down in the Property Inspector, and you'll see that the checkbox has got a content property. As soon as you see that, you should be able to guess that the checkbox control has got a content presenter. Next to it, though, we've got a white square. When I press F5, you're probably pretty familiar with this, but the white square turns yellow as soon as the mouse gets near it, and when I click it, the click itself causes the box to gray out, and then each click enables or disables a red check mark. The functionality of the checkbox is that I have a control that when I click on it, I change from one state to another. Everything else beyond that, we can modify the look however we want. So let me close this window, and let's modify the template for our checkbox. Now before we do this, I'm going to switch over to my Resources Inspector because I want to show you something. When I expand my window, I have a couple extra resources. I have the control here. This resource is stating that the default state for any buttons should go to this. This resource doesn't have a key because it acts as the default where anything else would have to be set to the specific key. In other words, when I look at the style property, especially in the XAML, if I'm not specifying what style to use, it will use the default. But when I created that, I got 3 additional resources that were created automatically. The button border, the button normal background fill, and the button focus visual are a handful of extra pieces that are collected within a button. Anytime you copy one of the system templates, you'll get one or more of these additional styles that are brought into your XAML. If you delete any of these, you'll end up with broken references throughout those resources, and it can make quite a mess out of your application. So you just want to leave those alone and don't worry about them. Sometimes it can be handy that when you're creating new controls like this, to create them in their own resource dictionary. That way all of these additional styles don't get in the way and they don't confuse you when you're working with the controls that you want. Now let's take a look at what happens when I right-click and edit my checkbox. I'm going to edit a copy of my style, and I get my usual, give it a name, and give it a document. Well, this time I don't want to use it as the default, so I'm just going to call it Custom Checkbox. I'm going to go ahead and leave it in the window and press OK. Now, just like before, a handful of new properties have shown up, including check radio fill normal, stroke normal, and so on. I could modify these properties, and each one would have some modification to the custom checkbox itself, but unfortunately, if I were to modify these states, any checkbox that I created that references these particular resources would end up finding the ones in my window1.xaml before it found the ones defined higher in the application. So I would actually be overriding these styles on all of the checkboxes, not just my own. In most cases, you want to leave those styles alone and not really work with them, but feel free to experiment with them a little bit, and there may be situations where you actually do want to change them. So let's take a look over in the object tree and let's start working with our checkbox. For starters, you can see the brackets here that indicate that this is where the bullet resides in the tree. I can expand that, and I see another control called the bullet chrome. I also have the bullet decorator, which has in it the bullet and my content presenter. Now, all of this is how the Windows Presentation Foundation specifies a checkbox. I'm going to get rid of all of that and create one of my own. Personally, I find working with checkboxes, I like to work with an empty template instead of using the existing template, just because I find I'm throwing all of the existing stuff out anyway. Again, it's all up to you, and it's all up to what you're working with to decide if you want to keep what's present or start from scratch. The one drawback to starting from scratch is if you look over in my triggers palette, there's already a couple triggers defined for whether or not the template has content, whether or not it's enabled, and so on. And if I start from scratch, I'm going to lose all of those triggers, but I'm not too worried about that right now. So I'm going to actually undo creating that first template, and I'm going to right-click my checkbox, edit the template, and create an empty template. So I'm going to call it Custom Checkbox. When I hit undo, it actually stepped back to before I created my template altogether, So now there's no longer a resource name custom checkbox, so I can still use that name. Now I've got my empty template. When you're working with a checkbox or radio button, the first and key piece of information that you need to define is how the control looks when it's checked and how it looks when it's unchecked. When you're working with the checkbox, I find it easiest to specify how I want it to look when it's unchecked first, and then we'll use a property trigger to modify its appearance when it's checked. Now, for me, I want to create a checkbox that changes the entire text from red to green based on whether or not it's checked. So let's start. We'll switch back to the Properties Inspector because I don't really want to watch the Resources palette while I'm working. And with my template selected, I need to add a grid. Now, if I'm only going to have one control, I guess it's not really necessary to put a grid in here, but I still find even if I'm going to work with only one control, the grid allows me that comfort of being able to go back later and make the modifications. So let me add my grid. Let me add my content presenter. Now, this was the mistake I was pointing out before. I added my content presenter, but I didn't select the grid. Now the content presenter has replaced the grid, and I wouldn't be able to add any other controls should I want to later. Let's fix that real quick by putting the grid back in, double-clicking it, and now adding the content control. Let's reset my margins so that it takes up the entire space. I want to change the foreground of the content presenter to red. Remember, for right now, we're working on what happens when the checkbox is not selected. So let me scroll up. The content presenter only has an opacity mask. So how do I modify that text? Remember, a content presenter can be anything. It can be text, it can be a picture, it can be geometry, or anything like that. So I actually can't modify the colors of the text on a content presenter. So how do I get around that? Well, one way you could do that is to remove the content presenter and add in a text block. Let me do that right now. The content presenter is selected. I'll delete it, and I'll add a text block instead. Now by default, my text block is in edit mode, and I'm going to replace the text with my value. When I actually start using this control, I don't want the text to be my value, but if I made it blank, I wouldn't be able to see the properties that I'm going to be setting right now. So I'll press escape to come out of editing mode, and now I have the foreground property on the text block that I can go ahead and set.